Thanks for having me. My name is Alex Cowan. I'm the CTO of an enterprise software company myself. It's called Keynote Systems. I'm also the founder, and I'm the author of a book called Starting a Tech Business. And today's event, this is not a TED Talk. I'm absolutely here to entertain you, but I'm also here to make you more successful. 50 to 70% of enterprise software implementations fail, according to Forrester and Gartner, and they're not all on Microsoft Dynamics. So I think that we have to ask ourselves, why is this failure rate so appallingly high when there's such bright people and good products and excellent platforms available? And I think that the competitive environment has really increased for you guys as well, which for everybody here I think is a really good thing. So in IT 1.0 we had big siloed applications, then we got SaaS, and the beginning of more end-to-end apps and more third-party apps. And as we go to 3.0, we have specifically app stores, which you guys all participate in, the ISVs. And then we have non-cooperative applications, things like Yammer that don't go through the IT department. And then we're in the post-iPhone era of user experience. So users are expecting, even in the enterprise, even when they're working, they're expecting very high quality, very focal user experiences. So what I think this means for you all is more competition and higher expectations. But I think, again, for all of you, you showed up here, you care about your career, you want to do well. I think these catalysts are gonna favor you. And the good news is there's a few techniques that predictably increase the quality of your outcomes in this area. There's a big void between these and actual practice for a number of reasons, but what we're gonna talk about tonight is how you guys can bridge that void and walk out of here with a few practical things that you can walk into the office and apply tomorrow. It turns out that there's some very consistent patterns to companies that do these things successfully. One, they all have a foundation in design thinking. Two, at the core, everything they do is this empirical loop where they're always looking at what are we assuming about the outcomes we want to provide, how are we going to see whether we're successful or not, and then how are we going to learn from that and loop back through. They take these design thinking outputs and they create user stories and test cases to do high quality, focal product and promotion that are well tied in with the stories they're telling about their users and the things that they're learning. On the outside, they have a very transparent, very easy to understand business model. So the companies that I work with, we go through and we do these things, and it reliably increases the quality of their outcomes. So the first thing we'll talk about is this idea of design thinking. How many of you are familiar with that? Okay, a couple of you. I get the question a lot, well, if design thinking is so great, why are there all these papers about it, and so much explanation required? I mean, if it's so self-evident, why doesn't everybody just do it? And I think the answer is we're wired from way back when to want to compel other people to our ideas and our actions. It's just one of those unfortunate parts of human nature. But this idea of design thinking is much more effective for modern day, especially if you're in the business of making things and selling things to people. Design thinking has two primary pillars, all of which you can easily grasp: empathy and creativity. But somebody back when recognized that the seamstress could use a better implemented that didn't cause so much fatigue and was more precise, and they invented the sewing scissor. And you guys all have your own sewing scissors that you're creating as ISVs and as partners and Salesforce users, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to actually do that. First, I'm going to tell you a little story. I live out in the woods, and I have a mouse problem. So my go-to technique is design thinking. I work to create some empathy for my adversaries, these mice that were inhabiting my basement. So I went through, I learned about how they got into the house. I don't know if you know this or not, but mice have no bladder control. They just constantly urinate as they walk along. They prefer the edges of walls. They're speedy, they can evade a normal mousetrap a lot of the time. And they prefer peanut butter over cheese. There's a lot of things that we learned about watching Tom and Jerry about mice that aren't actually true. So I had to unlearn those things. And then I applied creative solutions to this first. I went around and I repaired all the spots where they were getting into the house. Then I used a UV light. I don't know if you know this or not, but a UV light will show you bodily fluids in the dark. Yeah. Never turn one on in a hotel room. You'll literally. I made sure that I put the traps along the edges of the walls so they were in the right place, and I validated where the mice actually were with this UV light. I bought these mouse traps called Snappies. These were clearly built by design thinkers. They're literally a better mouse trap. They have a little platform, so they immediately grab the mouse, and then they articulate 90 degrees instead of 180 degrees, so they can catch even the speediest mouse. And I use peanut butter. We have no more mice now. And we also had a minimum bloodshed, which I thought was also important. So when we get more complex subjects like people, more complex things, like using software, we need tools that are a little bit more robust. Personas are a good place to start. How many of you use personas in your product design work? Okay. So basically, the idea with a persona is that it's a vivid description of your customer segments, your buyers and your users. And it's a description in a specific operational context. So the woman who works 5 buildings away from here, she may be one persona to the company whose accounting software she uses and another persona to people whose running shoes she buys. But the main thing is to make sure you can walk around in these persona shoes, that you understand them, that you're thoughtful about them, that you acquire that empathy, so you can apply a very directed kind of creativity to that. You want to be able to walk around in their shoes. And in fact, not to give away all my tricks, but when I work with companies and teams, one of the first questions I ask them about their personas is, what kind of shoes do these people wear? It's a good litmus test for whether or not you've really been able to envision this person. This is an example of a bad persona. I see a lot of these. I've made this persona. The photo is stock art, and they're bullet points here. And bullet points are okay. Actually, they're usually not okay. But they're not very good at storytelling. And your job as a design thinker and a creator of personas is to be a good storyteller. Bullets aren't very good at telling stories. And finally, there's percentage response data here that looks like it was the answer to the question, hey, would you like my such and such? And they may seem like a good idea, but it can lead to very misleading things. Do any of you know the story of the yellow Walkman in Sony's focus group? It's kind of a design thinking urban legend. So does everybody know what a Walkman is? I go to a lot of universities, they're not. That explains. Sony had this yellow Walkman, the thing that played magnetic cassette tapes and rendered music. And they went and they had a focus group. They asked all these people, hey, we have this yellow Walkman. What do you think? Do you like this? And they said, oh, God, it's wonderful. It's so much more interesting than the black Walkmans that you used to have. And so I said, great, this looks like it's going to be a big success. And somebody else running the focus group had the foresight to put 2 piles of Walkmans on the way out, a black pile and a yellow pile. They let everybody participate and take one, and you know what happened? Everybody took the black Walkman. So it's crazy, right? Why did they perpetrate this act of mass lying on their focus group moderator? It's because, one, people don't really know themselves that way. They don't know what they would buy or do given the situation in advance. And 2, people are nice. They don't want to tell you that your baby's ugly. They will always tell you something nice. And it's a good thing that people are like that. So the moral of the story is you can ask people questions like, how many times did you go to the dentist last month? You can even ask them, how did you feel when you went to the dentist? You can ask them, do you have a budget next year to do such and such on Salesforce? But if you ask them, hey, would you like my thingamajig, hypothetically, you're not going to get very good data. This is an example of a somewhat better personas. This is a photo that was taken with an iPhone out in the real world, which is where you need to go to learn about personas. And there are sentences here. There's a story about this person, Mary the Mom. The Mary the Mom thing is a little trick I like to use when I'm working with people developing personas, because it's just one more thing that helps you keep the persona from veering off and becoming something arbitrary and disembodied from a real person. At Leonid, our customers are cloud communications providers, companies like Comcast, Verizon, Deutsche Telekom. And these are some personas of their end users, so people we kind of build software for on behalf of our customers. You can see there's quite a lot of them. And these are enterprise users. So these are people that work at our customer, the cloud communications provider. And one thing I'll point out here is, and it's not really just about quantity, it's about quality. It's very important, particularly in the environment that you all operate in, to make sure that you've thought through not just your primary user personas, the people that sit and use your product day after day, but everybody that's involved with them in that interaction. Because if there's someone, especially as you're scaling, which you want to do, if there's someone's involved in a critical interaction that helps your user use the product, even if they maybe touch your product a few times a year, that can really derail the entire situation for you and make people not use your product, make the competition pull ahead of you. Now we get to the real meat of this thing. There is this idea of think, see, feel, do, which is a good way to operationalize your personas. It's a kind of checklist after you've described them to make sure you've really thought through everything that they endeavor to think about, see, feel, and do in your area. And then we get at these problem scenarios. So this is a real life problem, a need, a desire that you've ascertained that this persona has. And you should be able to identify an alternative for each of those. By the way, these slides are online. I love when people take photos of my slides. It makes me feel wonderful. But you can get at them whenever you want. The alternatives you should be able to identify because they have this need or desire, they're doing something. So if you can't do that, maybe you need to work through the problem scenario in a little more detail. And then you lean your value proposition against the alternative. So this is something that you're going to deliver with your product or service that's better enough than the alternative where the customer is going to invest the time or the money or whatever it is you want to have out of the customer relationship for you. Storyboards may seem a little bit silly and puerile, but they're actually a really great way to make sure you've thought through the customer experience and that you have a shared understanding of that you can share with your colleagues. This is a relatively simple storyboard about a web application that Leonard offers that allows people to change around the buttons on their office phone. So before, the phone gets dumped on this receptionist who has a very particular way that he or she wants to use the phone. She doesn't get it, she calls support, she hates that, the operator loses money on the support call, it's terrible. In the after situation, she gets our web app, she's showed how to help herself do what she wants to do, which is exactly what she wants to do, and everybody avoids wasted time and money. So this is a simple example. I'm going to show you another one of these at the end, maybe a little germane to your activities. In practice, I usually, my colleagues and clients usually put these up in these kind of tables. You might ask to add a little more detail. You might ask, well, why, if you're going to write all this stuff down, what's the point of the storyboard? And I think you'll find that they're a really good way to engage everybody in a shared understanding of the experience you're trying to provide to the customer. So we're going to do a little exercise. For 4 minutes, take the index cards or pad that you have and write down 3 personas in your particular area. It doesn't matter if you're an ISV, a consultant, an internal Salesforce administrator. And then with the time you have left over, start writing about that persona. Do things, see, feel, do on them, and see what you come up with. I will call up. All right. I hope that worked well for you. We're going to come back to this. So one of the greatest things about personas is how fundamental they really are. They should be the basis for when you make something, what are you going to deliver to the user and why? And as you see what the user actually does with your product, you should be bringing that stuff back and reinforcing and strengthening this foundation that you have with the personas. And when you're out selling stuff, this should likewise tell you who are you going to sell this to, through what mediums, and with what proposition. And as you learn what works, likewise, feed it back into the personas, continue to strengthen them. This is how you actually make these work for you on an ongoing basis, not just some exercise that you do at one point that everybody tries out. There are 4 principal ways to create personas. Interviews are absolutely the anchor and the bedrock of this activity. Going out, talking to real people in your segments. And AdWords and landing page tests are a great way to test, especially if a new thing that you're rolling out, whether you're able to get the attention and the interest of your target customer. But the interviews are still the anchor of that activity, because that's where you will learn about the language they use to talk about their problems and the heuristics they use to think about the problems that they actually have. Real-time recording and analytics, those are great. I particularly like products like Click and Mouse will let you record all the user sessions on your site. Those are very useful, especially in the early days. And how many of you are familiar with this idea of a minimum viable product? Okay, a lot. Good. The basic idea there is this is the minimum product execution that will allow you to test your value propositions with the customer. There are a few ways to do this. I will show you a link to this venture design template, which is totally free. It's online. It allows you to do this stuff. But one key thing I think is good for everybody to do, no matter how they go about this, is to separate out the presentation items, things you have to show to a particular audience for a particular purpose, from the things that you actually use to operate your business. Because if you're doing this stuff, you'll touch these things very regularly. So this is a link where that stuff is, if you want to take note of it. And again, these slides are online. Maybe Brian will provide a link to them afterwards. So now we're going to talk about this idea of validated learning and using these assumptions constantly to go and learn about whether you're just generating output or whether you're generating actually good outcomes that matter to what you're trying to do. So the great thing about all this minimum viable product and lean startup stuff is that back when we had this idea of a 5-year plan, which I actually think was invented by Stalin to run communist dictatorships. And it doesn't work very well for projects or products where you've got a lot of novelty and uncertainty and you're in learning mode. The way that this lean startup stuff works is that you take your design thinking outputs, you're learning about the customer and the user, you ask, do I have something compelling here? And then you stand up all the critical things that have to be true for this to be the incredible business of your dreams or the incredible project of your dreams. You design the shortest, simplest experiments to go and get that answer before you go out and create a lot of work for yourself. Again, this comes back to that whole thing of generating outcomes, not just generating output. You focus on those, and then you figure out, do I need to rinse and repeat here, or do I have something that I should scale up and throw a lot of resources at? I do a lot of entrepreneurial workshops, and one of the biggest problems I help executives work with is people throwing too much resource at their project teams before they're ready for them, when they're in discovery mode. Kind of ironic, it's not your typical corporate scenario, I guess, but it is a part of doing this that you don't want to overuse resources. Otherwise, you're just going to be in meetings with all these people that are running around doing this stuff, and they really don't know what they should do yet. Despite the popularity of lean startup, I'm always shocked at how few companies I go and visit actually have written down all their key assumptions. Now, I just like to use a simple table like this personally. I have the priority, the assumption, whether it needs to be proven, and notes on the experiments I'm going to use to go execute it. So this is an assumption for, let's say we're all going to go make an app that allows parents to distribute allowances to their kids. This is a pivotal assumption. It has a priority 1, because if this isn't true, you need to substantially reformulate the idea. This second assumption, you notice it's a priority 2, is an idea for a feature. So it's not pivotal, because there very well may be a terrific market, terrific set of uses for this application without this particular feature. So it absolutely is good to go out and validate this and test it, but it's not pivotal. And some assumptions, like this one, don't need to be proven at all. But the key thing with lean startup is this focus, when you're in the learning phase, when you have uncertainty, of being completely and totally focused on these pivotal assumptions before you run around and waste a lot of time and energy and money. So there's also this idea of lean at large, and the whole idea is, for more tactical things, let's not argue about this. Let's just state what our assumptions are and figure out how we're going to go test them. I'll give you a simple, very tactical example of this. This is a set of test cases for a user story for a product I'm working on with some collaborators. And there's a design metaphor, as experienced as a lot of us are building software, we don't really know if the user's going to get this or not. You know, to be honest with ourselves, we really don't. So we have a table of user experience assumptions. These are the focal things that we're going to test at the very earliest moment when we have working product to show to people. And we're not going to spend a lot of time detailing out all the facets of it until we do that. So this is an example of more tactical use of these lean principles. We're going to do another exercise. I hope you enjoyed the last one. This will be the same duration, 4 minutes. Write down 3 assumptions on something you're doing. If you're not doing a new venture or a new product, that's okay. Just think about a project you're doing. Every project has uncertainty. Write down at least 3 assumptions, and then start making notes after you finish that on what things you can do to prove those assumptions out or disprove. We'll take 4 minutes for this. So how do you actually put things together to go do these things? Back when we had this idea of aping, well, we'll make the start of a big company, or we'll make this project a big project by just acting like it's a big project. But as crazy as that sounds, it happened a lot, and shockingly it didn't work. There's this rubric of customer development, which is a great way to look at this stuff. It has 4 phases that you see here, which are a great way to think about where you are in this process and what you should be focused on. In the discovery phase, you have no product yet. Your assumptions are nascent. You're figuring out what they should be. You have no product. You're still learning about your personas. You're diagnosing problem scenarios and leaning value propositions against them. Your organization is just the founders. You don't need a lot of people at this point. And you probably don't want partners or channels any more than you need them, because you really want your hands very directly on the customer. Once you feel like you have something compelling, you create this minimum viable product. This is the minimum amount of execution, which may or may not be working software, by the way, that will allow you to go and test your key assumptions. You're testing your pivotal assumptions in this phase. You've got this MVP. You have a customer development team. The basic idea here is that this is the minimum amount of skill sets and people you need to go and prove or disprove these assumptions. And that's important because you don't want, a siloed functional organization. You want an organization that can work in very small batches, very quickly, very transparently, to get to the right answer, to accomplish this learning mission. And still profitable soon for partners. You exit this phase when you get a product market fit, meaning if you have a product that there's a substantial market for it that you can identify, or we'll say a project user fit. We do business layer implementations all the time. I get this question from executives. I'm thinking of rolling out Salesforce, and it certainly doesn't seem like a good idea to just get everybody on it at one time. Should I do a region or a particular functional slice? How should I do this? And I think the specific answer to that will depend, but the process is very much what we've discussed here. You need to first learn about the users, figure out what's important to them, bite off a soluble piece with criteria for success that are going to make sense, hit doubles, make friends, and then scale the thing up. So during customer creation, and this is the hard part for traditional managers and structures, is that this is where most people start, this customer creation stuff. This is sort of the build it and they will come problem. At this point, you should have all these tactical and strategic assumptions validated. You're focusing on making the product delivery more efficient, extending it incrementally based on things you've learned, and you got a full organization, and maybe you're working with partners. Then you're scaling up. We won't really go into this, but I think it is worth noting that having a scalable company, part of that is having the audacity to say, we need to think about what the startup down the street would do. And we need to be able to loop back through all this stuff and do that again. So, at the exterior of any successful venture or any successful project is a relationship to a business model. This is why the business exists and how it makes money. How many of you are familiar with Alex Osterwalder's business model canvas? Just a couple of you, okay. This is a very nice, transparent, easy way to talk about the business model, make notes on it. You can see that the gray side is kind of the delivery side, and the blue side is the revenue customer side. And the most important thing about this business model canvas, it looks like a lot of stuff. Here's the good news. The most important thing is exactly what we've been talking about this whole time, this pairing of customer segments described by personas with value propositions. This really should drive everything else in a business model canvas. This is an example of how you might show the relationship between your segments and the value propositions, how those things relate to revenue. There's a template for this I'll show you at the end that you can go use if you like. I get the question a lot. I go to a lot of universities, and I get the question a lot. So if I'm doing a career pivot or I'm a student, what skills do I need to actually go do this stuff? And my answer is always, do I need to learn how to code? And my answer is always, these foundation skill sets will help you a lot, and they'll help you steer things in the right direction, figure out what else you want to do. If you don't have a software programming background, how many of you have a software programming background? Just out of curiosity. So like maybe a third or half of you. If you don't have that, there's a few concepts here that will help you relate to your peers that are doing implementations much better, make you more effective, without necessarily learning how to code, though I would never discourage anybody from doing that. There's material on my site about this, there's material in the book about it. Doing Agile is a great experience if you can find a company that does that. And then maybe you want to learn a specialty discipline. So the last functional area we'll talk about is development. So you've probably all heard how terrible Waterfall is and how universally good Agile is. That's not what we're going to talk about. But we will talk about how to take all this stuff and marry it to user stories and test cases to get nice, well-linked, transparent implementations that fit with the rest of this stuff. And then how to get quality product and promotion. So not just the stuff that you're coding, but also all the things that go around that. The great thing about Agile, how many of you are in an Agile shop? Your company does Agile. Okay, so about half of you. The great thing about Agile is its primary input is exactly the outputs of this design thinking stuff, personas and user stories that talk about how you're going to deliver on a value proposition. Now, I think there's a lot of intimidation about Agile because over the years there's these Nazi Scrum Masters and gigantic, huge books about Agile, and it's a little forbidding at this point, I think, for a lot of people. But the original Agile manifesto was only 68 words. It was very simple, and it was really about foundation concepts. And it said, we value personal interactions over processes and tools. We value working software over big, long specs. We value collaboration over negotiation. And this should sound familiar at this point. We value responding to change over following some arbitrary plan. How many of you, so do all of you that do Agile write user stories? Is that how you decide what you're going to build? Raise your hand if that's true. Okay, so a few of you. So the stories have this very specific syntax. As a persona, I want to do something so that I can derive some kind of benefit. It's simple enough, right? The interesting thing is that even when I'm working with my own staff and Leon, I still have to train everybody to include this last clause, which is funny because it's, especially in the early phases, it's the most important. This clause is itself a little mini assumption about why we think the user wants to do something. And it is the best way to avoid a situation where you're just sort of producing output that no user actually cares about. And it's the best way to thread what you're going to do in product development or system deployment back to real problem scenarios and real value propositions that somebody cares about. This is an example of an epic story that we wrote at Leon about that web application for people to configure their office phones. You can see here, okay, the receptionist wants to have a good out-of-the-box experience. It seems simple enough, right? We just make it good. Well, what that has to mean is that the product manager at our customer, which is a company like Verizon or Comcast, can go in and decide what that out-of-the-box experience is with a visual interface. If they have to go to the IT persona, we know that that process is going to take forever, it'll probably never happen, and they won't get to create a good out-of-the-box experience because that's going to differ based on what they do. So this is an example of how to really look at all the different personas involved in something you're going to go execute and make sure you're attending to them, and translate those things into an actionable format so you're covering it with your actual execution. Here's another one. The receptionist wants to be able to change the buttons on the phone. Also, on its surface, it seems pretty transparent, right? We'll make sure it works. But there's a principle, if you have a lot of empathy for our persona here, we know that there's a principle that applies here in user experience called safe exploration. How many of you are familiar with that? Very applicable in enterprise systems. The idea is if you present the user something that looks complicated, that they have a little trepidation about, if you possibly can, it's good to put a reset button. Because then they know the worst thing that can possibly happen is they just go back to home base. Nothing terrible will happen. So this is another example of how to actually encapsulate that, your learnings about the user, in a way that's actionable for your implementation teams. Another thing about Agile I think is notable when you pair it with Lean is that classically Agile has this idea of an omniscient product owner, somebody who can tell you anything you want to know, answer any question. When we do this Lean startup stuff, we know that that's not going to be the case. There are things that we just don't know, and we're a lot better off acknowledging those things and figuring out how we're going to prove them or disprove them than blindly assuming them or arguing about them or anything like that. So your job as a product owner, as an IT project manager or a product manager at an ISV, is to go and validate the output you've created with your product development team, with the users, and see if it's actually providing a valuable outcome or not. In the present, you're working with your team. In the future, you're taking your learnings and reincorporating them. How many of you do process designs before you go do an enterprise software implementation? Just one brave man way in the back of the room. I salute you, because it's very difficult to do process designs, and most of them are not very good. And they're not very good for a lot of different reasons, but you can make them good with the tools that we've gone over here. You can use design thinking to be more thoughtful about users. They take that as your starting point. And you can be more thoughtful about the consumers of your process design. Who's going to use this thing? How? How do you package it up in a way that's usable for them? All this stuff applies not just to software, but it can apply to the most mundane thing, like a spreadsheet or a memo or an email. You can use Lean Startup when you're doing a process design to acknowledge the uncertainty that normally you're just going to say, well, we'll just assume they're going to do it like this. And they're probably not. They're probably going to hate it. This is why 50 to 70% of enterprise software implementations fail, is just kind of smudges like that. The accumulation of those smudges creates terrible enterprise software implementations. How many of you cleaned up after a terrible enterprise software implementation? Okay, yeah. So we've all been there, and we've all probably caused these too. I know I have. But our job here is to try to avoid that and be honest with ourselves about what we know and we don't know. So that's important. Using the business model canvas is a great way to keep looping whatever you're doing in this implementation back to something that's significant for the business. Using Agile is a great way to package this stuff up. This is an example of an atomic process. Notice that it has a discrete input and it has a discrete output in a series of transformative steps. Okay? If it doesn't have that, it's not a real actionable process. It might be a to-do list or a Notion or a reflex, but it's not really a process. Every process should also have each of these 3 types of metrics. Even if you don't care about them for every single process, it's an important litmus test to make sure that you really understand what this process is. And if you're doing an enterprise software implementation of any substance, I highly recommend using this discipline of process design paired with all the other things to decide what you want to have happen and know if it's a success or not. Like any big, complicated thing, you also need a nice, workable decomposition. The best way to do that is to link, there's this idea of key activities in the business model canvas, which I didn't go over, but you can go read about. This is a great way to create a top layer with significance to the business when you're doing a process design. The key activities in a business model are the top 3 to 6 critically important things that the business needs to do to execute on its mission. And then you layer functional processes and sub-processes under that for additional detail. This is a little bit more intricate process. This is what it looks like in at least the kind of documents we produce at Lean, where we do supplement these with additional detail. So how do you validate the outcomes? Because I hope you're wondering that at this point, because that's what's really important. We do this process design, it governs the way that we implement. How do we know if we did any good or not? Well, there's a system for this. It's pretty well accepted. You want to zero out, if you can, NVA time. This is basically wasted time that people have waning or fixing broken processes. You want to minimize PVA time. This is time spent answering questions or reporting things to the business. And this is the promise of a lot of enterprise software projects, right? Especially to the user. Do this through the system, and nobody will come and bug you anymore about what do you have going on, where are you with this or that. And you want to maximize RVA time, it's time spent making stuff and selling stuff that actually delivers to the bottom line. So this is a different URL. There's some templates here and a tutorial if you're interested in that. So to take this full circle, we create personas. This is who we're working with. We learn about their problem scenarios. We lean value propositions and assumptions against those, which are why do we think they want to buy something from us or use our stuff. We create user stories and we can create prototypes to figure out what our execution actually ought to be when we go give it to our implementer. And then we figure out, did we have something good, or do we need to revise, or do we scale this thing up? We're going to close with a storyboard about, I hope it represents your life a little bit to a degree. So not this one actually, this is the bad one. So Pablo, the project manager, is handed this big Salesforce project. It's a career-making project. He creates a big elaborate plan that can't possibly fail because it's so intricate and so detailed. What could go wrong, right? He goes around and asks everybody their requirements, right? Because that's what you're supposed to do as a good project lead in enterprise software. You ask people what are their requirements. The first sign of trouble is when his implementer tells him this stuff is crazy. This can't possibly result in good implementation that people are going to like. But he stays on plan. He's very busy because he's got so many people on this project team that he doesn't need yet that he's got to constantly figure out what they should be doing or he's going to look like a jerk, right? So there's no shortage of things to do, and you see this doesn't end well. And then the fact is, this is just no way to do things. This is why so many enterprise software implementations fail. This and other reasons, but these are some of the big ones. Requirements don't work. They're a great way to make sure that you feel like somebody told you something that you can hold them accountable to, but it's not a good way to get to actually good outcomes. Let's look at an alternative. So the same thing, same starting point. Instead, Pablo, the first thing he does is he goes out, he learns about all the various users, probably from the functional leads. But functional leads are just like, yeah, I don't know, my people answered trouble tickets. He has to go talk to the individual users. Most of my customers in the early days of Lean think that I'm such a weirdo. They think I'm some kind of weird enterprise software voyeur because I want to go to people's cubicles and look at what they actually do. But this is so important because this is what really determines whether what you guys are doing succeeds or fails. So Pablo takes a process design, which may change, to management. He says, look, I think this is the big picture of what we should do and why. And let's take a small piece of this, case management. I've got some success criteria, and I want to try this out first and see how it goes. So he creates user stories. He gives them to his implementer. It works great. But they only do the minimum implementation before they show it to a user. And they ask that user for real validated empirical feedback, not just, hey, does this look good or not? Then they go in, they've hit doubles, they've made friends, and they're ready to scale this project up. So if you're a Salesforce user, I hope you'll think about trying some of these things to improve your projects. If you're a consultant, I hope you'll find some things you can use to help your clients get better outcomes. And if you're an ISV, I hope some of this will help you with product development and delivery. So the URL for this talk, the footage is going to be up in a few days, is here. The central directory for all these resources I keep mentioning is here. I have a free 5-cycle program called Startup Sprints that you can take. It's totally self-service, but I also do workshops on it. And I'm rolling out a Startup Sprints themed birthday party if you have kids. I'm great with kids. This is my contact information. So I hope you'll think about trying out some of these things. And if you do, I hope you'll tell me about it. Get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to get started, what's the best way to, as just a worker bee, so to speak, not a C-level type person, how can I get started?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. You do not need, the first reaction a lot of people work at larger companies, well, I'm going to go learn about this design thinking stuff, and I'm going to sell management on it. don't bother. You can't get in trouble for doing this stuff. Just do it. Start doing it. There's nothing, absolutely nothing stopping anyone in this room from starting to go out and do this stuff. And the way I would start doing it is I would look at some of those talks. I would go to the resources directory. There's tutorials, templates, and examples that all kind of marry together for you to start doing this stuff. And I would move from personas to problem scenarios to user stories right at the business model canvas. It's okay, even if you feel like that's above your pay grade, just do it. Show it to somebody. You're not going to get in trouble. And that's what I would do. It's very important. All this stuff is a lot easier shown than told about. You have to actually do it.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, I love this presentation, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Personas is...
Let's talk afterwards.
Okay, sure. And I love it so much, I want to see if you have a half an elevator pitch for the waterfall functional company stuck in the, whatever, last century. And then, you're trying to, let's say you're going to do a project for them and they want to go the standard route requirements, but you want to succeed with this. What's your shortest, look here, get them excited rather than Agile, because some people already have an aversion to that. They're like,
yeah.
No, I don't want to hear this cycling, which means you're just not doing your due diligence. I want to see it planned out with a Gantt chart. So,
yeah. Now, are you, in this situation, as our hypothetical person, an outside party or an inside person?
I'd be the architect, like, trying to, move forward with your company.
You have to spend some extra time and just create personas, draft a process design. You don't have to do absolutely all of this stuff, like end to end. Don't do that. Do it in small batches. So do a little bit of this stuff and show them, hey, I'm going to do my job. Here's how I'm going to do it. Give them some examples. Show them some output. Try it out yourself. Because if you haven't done it, you won't be able to sell them, right? You won't have that. Even if there's some magical words if there was an incantation I could give you guys to convince people to do this, I would speak it to you right now. I would write it down, I would send it to Brian, he would send it to you. There isn't such a thing, but trying this stuff out and actually doing it, take a Saturday, send the kids to their grandmas and just try to do some of this stuff. In 4 to 6 hours, you can create a lot of stuff here that you can use. Go to a meeting and, talk about assumptions instead of, opinions, It's really the everyday stuff that makes this stuff actually work. Does that help?
Anybody else? All right, well, thank you again very much.